Welcome on into the Cougar Tracks podcast, powered by KSLSports.com. I am your BYU insider, Mitch Harper, coming to you from Waco, Texas. I was just in my hotel room watching that wild Miami-Virginia Tech finish. Couldn't believe that. Then I flip over to Fox and see Washington and Rutgers coming down to the wire on a last-second field goal attempt. So a wild night in Friday college football action. We'll see if BYU and Baylor keep the wild game streak rolling in the Saturday morning session coming up here in Waco on the banks of the Brazos River. But it was a wild night in college football on Friday. Curious to see what BYU Baylor produces, which has the potential, I believe, to be in stretches a defensive slugfest. I don't think it's going to be one of those perfection games where BYU just blows the doors off of Baylor. It'd be amazing if they did. But remember, this is a spot now where you're in a power conference. You don't need style points anymore. No longer do you need to just win convincingly, because now in the 12-team playoff era, you just got to win your league. And it doesn't matter if it's 3-0 or 38-9 or 40-0, whatever it is, just win the ball game. And I think that's got to be the goal here for BYU. Clearly, that's the goal every week, but I don't think fans should get worried about style and how it plays out. Like if you have this could be a SMU style game, and with what we've seen in the body of work to this point compared to what we saw entering the SMU game, I'm okay with a bit of a rock fight game if it ends up playing out that way. But I'll share my thoughts here in this matchup. BYU and Baylor kickoff at 10 a.m. on Saturday. Extended pregame begins on KSL News Radio here in Waco at 7 a.m. The radio call will be on KSL News Radio, and then the TV broadcast on FS1. So I flew into Waco on Friday afternoon. I got in around 5:30 Central Time. The airport is the tiniest airport I've ever been in, and that was nice to breeze through. I get to the rental car pickup, and they're like, "Mr. Harper, we got your car ready for you." I'm thinking they don't have really any business, so they knew me by name. It was great to see, because I've had other experiences recently with car rentals where it's a pain in the neck. So I love the hospitality so far here in Waco. I drove around campus a little bit, and I always love doing that, kind of getting a sense of, is there any excitement or maybe any signs of frat houses poking fun at BYU or whatnot. There were some cowgirl hooray celebration in the middle of campus. I don't really know what, but it was a bunch of college women dressed in cowgirl outfits, I guess, and they were just having a good time. Got to see, the Baylor campus a bit. Drove around, saw some of the sights and things like that. But, Waco's pretty cool. I looked at the population. It's about 150,000 people live here. It's not huge. It's not a big place, but it is a, tight-knit community that likes its Baylor Bears, and I expect a decent atmosphere coming up tomorrow. Did see some BYU fans in town already. There's a few BYU fans at my hotel, so I expect that Cougar Nation will show up in Waco like they did 3 years ago. I remember in the game in 2021 when BYU traveled here, months after being invited as a Big 12 conference member, Baylor fans were so excited to sell out their homecoming game against BYU. And then they get there and they realize, oh man, this sellout is because of BYU fans. No word on the sellout side of things this time around. But, this should be a pretty good football game. And I don't think it's, completely inaccurate by the Vegas sharps to project Baylor as the favorite in this football game. BYU still got a lot to prove. I think there's, coming out of that Kansas State game, it's a feeling of, well, will that carry over to the road? BYU's defense will show up, But will the offense do what they did on the road? Can you assume that they're going to get so many short fields against Baylor? And I can understand why it's an underdog line. But then you look at some computer metrics and models. BYU's a favorite in the ESPN FPI. So this is a toss-up football game. And I think that's the beauty of the Big 12 Conference, is that even when you have ranked teams and maybe a team that's perceived to be down and out, they still have the personnel and enough talent to give you a scare and a test. Now, there's always going to be that question of how high is the talent in this league, the level in which, the top end of this conference, can it compete with the SEC and Big Ten? First thought would be probably no, but week after week, there's good football in this league, and I think this will be a really good test for BYU. And if they come away victorious, this would be a really good win for this BYU team. Keep in mind, BYU has not won a Big 12 road game yet. They're still looking for that. They were 0-5 a season ago, so trying to get that first Big 12 road game any way you can do it would be huge for this BYU team. Some storylines coming into this game for BYU and Baylor. The availability of Sione Aimoa will be an interesting storyline to monitor going into game day on Saturday morning. Moa was seen on campus by a student reporter in a boot, and Aaron Roderick acknowledged that Moa was banged up after the Kansas State game, so we'll see his availability. And he's critical, in my opinion, because he was a breakout performer in last week's win over Kansas State. But the good news is that BYU does get Hinckley Ropati back, and Ropati is in a spot where he has to perform. This is his chance to be a stud, because BYU cannot just be one-dimensional. Baylor's got the defensive personnel to give BYU headaches. Last week, Baylor had 8 sacks, and I know it was against Colorado. Colorado does not have a good offensive line, but look, folks, you listening, I assume if you're listening to this, you're probably a Cougar fan, and you have seen many BYU teams in the past, in recent past, go up against bad offenses on opponents and still not generate sacks, particularly in recent years. So just the proof of concept that this Baylor defense has got personnel that can get home and get to the QB. They've got guys, and they generated 8 sacks last week, and I really like some of their defensive personnel that they have. I looked at, they have Garmin Randolph. He left the game last week against Colorado. He's one of their leading sack artists. He had 2.5 sacks this season, but he got banged up a week ago. I'm curious to see, his availability this week. Steve Linton, a Texas Tech transfer linebacker, he is really good. 2 sacks last week, 2 tackles for loss in that loss against the Colorado Buffaloes. So he's a name to keep an eye on for Baylor as well. But, Dave Aranda's, another big storyline going into this game is the status of Dave Aranda. And it was kind of out of nowhere this week when Baylor star quarterback Robert Griffin III, the former Heisman winner, just goes to X and gives a public vote of support for Dave Aranda for him as the head coach. And, you're in year 5, and you heard in the interview earlier this week with Craig Smoke, there's a feeling of, is this just going to get any better? Is it going to improve? For a Baylor program that spent a lot of money on their facilities, I mean, this is the 10th year of McLean Stadium. They invest heavily into their athletics, and, it's a football program. This is not the days when it was, I think, Kevin Steele, where they were just a complete afterthought in college football. This is a winning program. I mean, they've won, I believe, 101 games in the last, 12 years or so. It's been a winning football program, and they have high expectations. And Aranda had that 1 year in 2021, but outside of that, it's been a whole lot of nothing. But Aranda is good enough for a one game to devise a defensive scheme that can give an opposing offense troubles. So BYU's offense better be on its A game for this matchup, and if they are, well, Dave Aranda is going to be feeling the heat a lot more if they lose this game. It's not that BYU is the type of team that sinks a job, but I think from an optics standpoint, it's a barometer for how maybe far Baylor has fallen. as far as just 3 years ago, you were at the top of this league and looked like there was no end in sight. And 3 years later, in a hurry, one of the newcomers who you beat that season 3 years ago in Waco and handily beat BYU, they're now coming into your place and beating you. It wouldn't be a good look for Aranda at all to suffer a loss here in this spot. So BYU's offense, though, in order to get this win, they need a formidable running game. And it's been a little bit underwhelming so far this year, and that's largely in part due to the injuries. If they had a healthy LJ Martin, this would be a ground attack that's having a lot more success. But through 4 weeks, Jake Retzlaff's the leading rusher with 100 yards so far for BYU. But they need a threat on the ground. I never like road game spots where you're one-dimensional. You've got to have that threat. Curious to see what Enoch Nawahine can provide as well. Maybe Miles Davis, maybe, but it feels like you lost your opportunity. You know, that Wyoming game against a bad Wyoming defense, he just didn't perform well enough to say you're going to hand him the rock against a much better Baylor defensive front. BYU's got to get the ball to their playmakers at wide receiver, Chase Roberts, Darius Lassiter, early and often. I'm also curious to see how BYU is going to continue to work in Reiner Swanson. You know, Keanu Hill's the veteran tight end, and, you know, he's been solid. It hasn't been anything earth-shattering. It's not living up to the hype that maybe there was buzz in spring and early fall camp about Kibo at tight end. But Reiner Swanson, the catches that he's hauling in, you know, you just see that power, that versatility, that burst of speed that he runs with the football after the catch. He's a guy that can get upfield and get you chunk yardage after the catch. So I really want to see Reiner Swanson continue to get more touches. He was dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury in fall camp, but now he's healthy, good to go. Swanson needs to have more targets. And I'd also say, too, Pokayawa Hunga is someone that I want to see more touches for as well, particularly if Sione Aimoa is not at full strength and not ready to go. But this game for BYU, they win this game, they're 5-0 going into the bye week, and after the bye week, you have 2 consecutive weeks at home. You win this game. Again, I go back to it earlier. It doesn't matter the style. Just find a way to win. Because if you do, everything is in front of you from a goal perspective, from a national narrative standpoint. BYU will have everything in front of them. And sure, if they win in an ugly fashion and the offense struggles, there will be questions and you'll really wonder what's the ceiling. I get all that, but still, just find ways to stack up wins. This conference has an ability to have teams emerge year after year where they win a bunch of close calls. Like, think back to Oklahoma State last year. A bunch of games where they were down big, then they roar back. They find a way to get to Arlington. And I know they lost to Texas, but they were 60 minutes away from winning a Big 12 title. You know, TCU 2 years ago, they were in so many close calls. I remember here in Waco, they had that last-second field goal attempt as the clock was expiring. They got the whole special teams unit out on the field and then rushed their way to a field goal kick, and they made it. So, again, if you get caught up in the whole, like, well, you got to look perfect every single game, you're never going to be happy. That's more for Kalani Sitake and the coaches. I think, again, and I'm trying to set modest expectations for this game because when I look at Baylor personnel-wise, they've got talent that matches up individually with BYU. But then you stack it up against BYU's, the cliche culture, the mindset of this BYU team. It's much improved from years ago. But as Baylor said in the offseason, they're paying dudes now. I mean, they had T-shirts coming into this year, their coaching staff, we pay players or we pay guys or whatever it was. And when you're paying, you're going to get some good guys. And Linton, the linebacker who had 2 sacks a week ago, who I mentioned, he's one of those dudes that's legit. So, but I feel like BYU is in a much better place in terms of support, momentum, whereas Baylor, they're still searching for their identity. And that points to the quarterback position too. Baylor at quarterback, 2 weeks ago, DeQuan Finn was out due to an injury. In comes Sawyer Robertson, former Mississippi State transfer who played last season for the Bears. I think he's been better. Baylor's offense, despite the loss last week, still put up 31 points. And I'd be surprised if it's not Sawyer Robertson against BYU on Saturday. That's just kind of where it feels like it's trending for Baylor. But DeQuan Finn, heralded transfer from Toledo, high expectations for him. It wasn't looking good against Utah. And when you're a coach like Dave Aranda who's feeling heat, you kind of just got to roll with the somewhat warm hand. I don't know if I want to call it a hot hand because Robertson still lost last week and they didn't get it done. But I would expect Robertson's going to be that guy against BYU. Defensively, I expect BYU is going to have success against Baylor. I do. I think BYU is going to make life tough for the Baylor offense. BYU doesn't give up big plays. And this year, they're not giving up passing touchdowns. In their 2 games against Power 4 competition, they haven't given up a passing touchdown. It's BYU and Georgia. They're the only 2 teams that can say that they've held out Power 4 teams twice out of the end zone through the air. So BYU's defense, I expect, will perform at a high level. That's what they've been doing. But I expect BYU is going to perform well. And, they've dug into their depth this year too. They've got options at a lot of different spots, and they're having success. I do want to see BYU's defense, though, be stout against the Baylor ground attack. Baylor's got an interesting situation at running back where they've got a handful of guys that have the makeup and the talent to be an RB1 on any given game. They've got Bryson Washington, who's probably got the most starts through the first 4 games of the season, but they also have Dominic Richardson, they got Dawson Pendergrass, and Richard Reese. Again, 4 guys that you look at and say that could be an RB1 for many teams in the Big 12. And, can BYU completely stonewall those guys, whoever carries the rock, and stops that ground attack? Because early in the Kansas State game, BYU was not having success stopping the run, and it's one of the reasons why, BYU coming into this game, you look at their rush rate, defensive metrics, they're 89th nationally, rush success rate 73rd nationally, so stuff rate 89th nationally. It's just a piece of the puzzle. Those are some advanced numbers, but that's an area where they can get better. And, that's where you wonder, is there success that they have had on stopping the run? Is it simply a byproduct of not many good running backs that they faced? Last week against K-State was the best group of tailbacks they've seen, and early on they struggled. I want to see BYU be stout, stopping Baylor's ground attack, because if Baylor's going to pull this upset off, they're going to have a big day on the ground against BYU. If they don't have a shot to win this football game. And Sawyer Robertson, I don't think can generate enough offensively to, I know he's had, back-to-back 30-point outings for Baylor's offense the last 2 weeks, but I don't see that happening against BYU. BYU is a much higher tier than Colorado's defense and especially Air Force. So stopping the run will be critical for BYU. So that's where you look at Blake Mangelson, John Nelson, Tyler Batty, Zay Banya, the defensive stalwarts up front, the senior leaders on that defensive line. They got to come up big for BYU. I think special teams is going to be big too. I mean, it has to be, right, for BYU. The last 2 weeks, it's been a massive piece. 2 weeks ago, they get a kickoff return for a touchdown against Wyoming, Keelan Marion, and then the punt return for a touchdown by Parker Kingston. That was just an epic play against Kansas State. So this week, I'm expecting it to be more Will Ferrin having an impact. And my thought on that is that there could be some drives where, maybe BYU's in Baylor territory, but it's 4th and 8, and it's a little bit, too long of a distance on 4th down. So Kalani and crew go for a field goal. And the trust that they have in Will Ferrin, let him, add 3 to the board and try to, boot it through the uprights that way. So I think that's going to be the big piece here. But it would be great if Marion or Kingston can pop off another return. I mean, I'd have to dig into the archive to find the last time BYU had 3 consecutive weeks with a special teams return touchdown. I mean, I'd have to think back on it. I'm sure it's happened, but off the top of my head, I can't recall 3 consecutive weeks of touchdowns in special teams returns. My first thought would be maybe 1995 or 1996 with James Dye. Was there a 3-week stretch there? But again, I'd have to double check. So the Cougs and the Bears here in Waco, looking forward to it, 10 a.m. kick. And let's bring up that too, the early morning thing. I haven't wanted to make that a huge storyline because this BYU team is better. The talent, the veterans, the experience, the adversity that they've faced in past years, this team's better. So I'd like to think that the 10 a.m.s thing is not a factor for this group. But it is something that's, of note because we all know the last 5 years BYU has not been good in day games compared to, night games. It's just what it is. They have not performed well in these games. And, even players acknowledge that the early morning wake-up calls have not been fun. No one likes it. I mean, who wants to get up at 6 a.m.? It's not ideal, but for a week and for a chance to get a massive win on the road and get the program's first ever Big 12 road win, I think getting off to a good start will be important for this BYU team because I think back to the TCU game last year, that was a day game spot in Texas, and TCU just jumped on BYU early, and their head was spinning. Baylor, I don't think they've got the personnel like TCU did, but TCU was also a losing team a year ago, and they looked like a juggernaut against BYU. I don't think it's the same circumstances this time around, but the Vampire Cougs thing is something to monitor, see how BYU plays in this game. I do believe BYU gets the win. I think they get it done 23-17. It's just a solid get in, get out, try to be injury-free, and go to the bye week and get ready for a homestand of 2 consecutive games in Provo. But I'll have full coverage inside McLean Stadium from here in Waco on KSLSports.com. Follow all my coverage on X and Instagram. We'll have you covered on the KSL Sports app, and listen to extended pregame beginning at 7 a.m. on KSL News Radio. I'll talk to you after the game to recap BYU and Baylor here from Waco. We'll do it right here on the Cougar Tracks podcast, and it's powered by KSLSports.com.